Today on Oklahoma Gardening, we discuss the 5 things to consider in order to have a successful garden. Join us as we talk about soil prep, planting seeds, pruning, weeding, and irrigation. Underwriting assistance for our program is provided by the Oklahoma Department of Agriculture, Food, and Forestry, helping to keep Oklahoma green and growing. Oklahoma Gardening is also a proud partner with Shape Your Future, a program of the Tobacco Settlement Endowment Trust. Shape Your Future provides resources for Oklahomans to make the healthy choice the easy choice.
I love sharing with you guys the cool things that plants can do. We're back here at the student farm. I want to share with you a tropical plant that you might find in some Oklahoma landscapes. It's important to know which plants we are dealing with so that we can continue to maintain them successfully for years to come. Each spring, people who've been gardening for years, as well as people who might be new to gardening, get excited about the idea of gardening. They have optimism and enthusiasm for it. Well, today we're going to share 5 things to consider in order to start your garden off successfully. Gardening can take on a lot of different forms, and whether you're starting with an established garden space or you're looking at constructing a garden space, you first want to think about soil preparation. And the best place to start is by soil sampling. A soil sample will give you those baseline readings of the fertility that is in your soil and available for those new plants. Now, this is nice to do at the end of winter, early spring, before you start fertilizing, so that you know exactly what you need to apply as you go through the season. And if you think, well, I'll just keep doing what I've always done, it might not always end in the same results. In fact, if you continue to do that, it has shown to lower the pH and also increase to excessive levels some of those nutrients. Plus, you might be throwing your money away because it might not be necessary. This is why soil sampling in the early stages of spring is a great way to get started. Now, for an ornamental herbaceous garden, you're kind of working with existing plants usually. And you can see here we have a lot of dead debris to deal with. So at this point in March, you can see a lot of the green plants are coming on now. And even though we've left this, it's important to leave it because it allows for winter protection and also for an environment for beneficial insects to overwinter. But at this point, it's time to remove this, allowing that vegetation to come on through. So you can use pruners simply to cut some of this back. Also, a large leaf rake or even one of these hand rakes is really nice to get all this debris out from around, like daylilies and some of your other perennial crops here. So we're going to continue to do this, but this stuff is actually still beneficial in your garden. So instead of just bagging it up and putting it out on the curb, make sure you add it into your compost pile. Now, for a vegetable garden, it's a little bit different. So you want to make sure that you're going ahead and smoothing out the bed as much as possible. You can use the back of a leaf rake to really get that smooth. And that's important so that when you're direct sowing your seeds, that the seeds actually stay in place where you're planting them. The other thing too is it's a nice opportunity based off of your soil test to go ahead and add any compost or any amendments that you might need to incorporate into the soil at this time. Remove any old plants, of course, as well, or debris that you might find in your garden. If you haven't ever cleaned out your vegetable garden from last season and you still have tomatoes and pepper plants in there, you want to make sure to remove those. And of course, if they didn't have diseases on them, you can add that to the compost pile as well. Now, if you did grow a cover crop during the fall season or into the winter months, you want to make sure that you begin to terminate that. And there's a couple of different ways to do that, but terminating that cover crop now will allow it to go ahead and incorporate into your planting soil before you actually plant your crop this season. So go ahead and start getting those vegetable gardens ready. Another option for gardening this season is, of course, container gardens. Containers are a nice addition to the garden for accents, or also if you're having a hard time getting down onto the ground level, containers really help elevate that a little bit more for you. Now, if you are container gardening, you want to make sure to always use potting soil or potting media, not actual topsoil. So potting media is composed of different materials, usually vermiculite, perlite, sphagnum or peat moss, and also sometimes bark mulch that's mixed in here. Basically, it's a combination that really allows that potting media to hold the moisture around that plant, but yet also adequately drain. Versus topsoil will not do that for you. So if you have used containers previously and you have old potting media in there, you want to make sure to go ahead and clean out that potting media because as it goes through a season, it breaks down and loses its ability to retain and also drain properly. So if you didn't have any disease problems or any root problems last year, go ahead and use that in your compost pile when you're cleaning that out. Now take advantage of having empty containers and also clean your containers with a 10% bleach solution. Again, it'll just kind of prevent any pathogens from carrying over from season to season. And finally, when you've got them all emptied and clean, it's time to go ahead and find you a nice potting soil to then fill them back up again and be prepared for this season. The weather can often be unpredictable this time of year. So on those warm days, make sure you're out doing your soil prep. But on those colder days, it's time to settle in and start thinking about what you're going to be planting out in your garden. And you can do that in a couple of different ways. There are several options as to how to go about planting your garden. One of those being starting your own transplants early. Now, starting your own seeds may require a little bit of upfront investment. You need some of your own containers, your potting soil, and usually a grow light, and of course some dedicated space in your home in order to do that. But one of the big advantages is the variety of seeds that you'll have available to you. So you're going to have a wider variety of plants that you can actually start versus what you might find later on growing at the garden center. Also, it will in turn save you money because just for a couple of dollars for a pack of seeds, you can grow a whole lot of plants. Another option for planting your plants is to direct sow your seeds. And that means basically we're planting the seeds straight out into the garden. There's a couple of benefits to this. It allows the plant to get established without having to worry about transplant shock as you move it from where you've been growing it to out in the new environment. So it allows it to kind of get used to and acclimate as it's growing and establishing itself. Now the drawback is that they are very small, so they can wash away. And you also have to be very vigilant about making sure and checking on them because as they start to develop, they just have a small root. So you're going to have to make sure that they have moisture as they develop. Now, it's not too early. Go ahead, get your cool season crops out there, such as your leaf lettuce and spinach. You can go ahead and plant that early because they are cool season crops. But also there are some warm season crops that you can direct sow, such as some of your squashes and okra and corn later on in the season. Another option for planting is to purchase transplants. Perhaps the spring kind of snuck up on you and you didn't have time to actually direct sow, or you didn't start your own transplants indoors. You can always purchase them from a local garden center. The nice thing about using transplants is it sort of gives you an instant gratification, because they are usually about 4 to 6 inches tall when you purchase them. So by putting them out in the garden, you're going to have that nice look already of a plant being established there. Now, usually you'll buy those in a 4 or 6 pack, or sometimes they come in a 4-inch pot. So one of the benefits of buying transplants is it allows you just to get a couple, so you could get just a couple of several different varieties versus a whole packet of seeds of one type of variety. The other thing too is when you're planting these, you want to make sure that you're planting them based off of the season that they're appropriate for. So there are cool season transplants like chard that you can put out, or you want to make sure to wait and plant your warm season crops like tomatoes and peppers after April 15th, when there's no more concern of frost. The other thing too is you want to make sure if you're planting tomatoes and peppers in your garden that you are either starting with transplants that you grew yourself or that you purchased. This gives that plant a head start so that you ensure that you're going to get fruit set before the summer heats up. Now, when it comes to our woody shrubs and trees, one of the big questions that a lot of people ask about is when to prune them. Well, that depends on the question of whether it blooms on old wood or new wood. And you're thinking, old wood and new wood, what's the difference? Well, basically, old wood and new wood determines when the plant is actually going to flower. So here we've got a couple of plants next to us, some shrubs, and you can see this quince is already blooming early in the springtime. One good indicator that it blooms on old wood is the fact that it blooms early in the spring. So these flower buds actually were produced on last year's vegetative growth. So if we were to prune this early in the spring, we would be removing these flowers, so you wouldn't actually have seen this beautiful display. This is an instance with flowering quince, the forsythias, azaleas, and even some hydrangeas. So be cautious and make sure to prune those after they're done flowering. Now in front of us here we have some crepe myrtles, and this is an example of a plant that blooms on new wood. So you can see it's still dormant for the season. It hasn't started producing any of that vegetative growth. So in fact, plants that bloom on new wood, you can go ahead and prune early in the springtime. It's not going to do anything. So if we wanted to maybe keep this in check a little bit, we could go ahead and lower this if we wanted to by pruning some of these branches out. Because what's going to happen is when the temperatures warm up, this is going to produce some of that vegetative growth, and then it'll produce those flower buds that you'll see later on in the summer months. So we're not actually removing any flower buds by pruning it early in the spring. So if it blooms on old wood, make sure to prune it after it blooms. If it blooms on new wood, then go ahead and you can prune it this spring. Now, when it comes to actually pruning, you want to keep a few things in mind. And before you start cutting anything, you're going to want to identify anything that is dead and diseased, because that's the material that you want to remove first, because it's not benefiting the plant anymore. So of course, dead stuff is not doing anything and it's only going to lead to more decay. And anything that's diseased, you want to make sure to remove it so that that disease doesn't potentially spread. So first of all, prune anything that's dead and diseased out of there. The other thing to look for is anything that might be crossing. Crossing branches, when our Oklahoma winds kick up, will rub on each other, creating an open wound that's an invitation for insects and disease to actually penetrate into that plant tissue. The other thing too is you want to look at maybe having an open center or an open canopy, because that will allow for better airflow, that will reduce disease, allow any moisture to kind of dry off, again reducing the potential for pathogens to spread. So think about creating an open canopy. If you see any branches that are going into that canopy, think about removing those, again allowing for that open canopy to develop more. And also a general rule of thumb is to never prune more than a third of the plant, because you're reducing the amount of vegetation, causing it to reduce how much it can actually photosynthesize and produce energy for that plant. So make sure when you're pruning, don't prune more than a third, and also to just kind of step back and take a look at it, because you can always go back and prune a little bit more, but you can never glue more back on the plant. Now let's talk about weeds, but before we do that, I think it's important to define what a weed is. A weed is simply a plant that is out of place, which means you as a gardener get to determine what is a weed, as what is a desirable plant and which one you deem is out of place. Now keep in mind though, as we've cleaned out our garden beds, weeds are simply plants, and they will also enjoy the warmer temperatures and the more moisture that comes with spring, which means a lot of those weed seeds are going to start germinating right along with your perennials that are growing and other seeds that you might have put out. So here's a few tips to consider in order to control your weeds this season. It's often said that one of the best things that you can keep in the garden is your own shadow, meaning that you should regularly be visiting your garden and visually inspecting that garden, not only for the desirable plants, but also some of the undesirable plants or the weeds that you might be finding coming up. Now, so often as a gardener, whether it's my garden or not, a lot of times gardeners have this need to just want to pull weeds when they see them. And so something as simple as pulling a few weeds as you go through the garden can help eliminate that weed problem before it gets too big, especially if you get them while they're small. Another way of suppressing your weed growth is simply by covering that warming soil, preventing some of those seeds from actually germinating. And one of the best covers to put out into your garden is some shredded hardwood mulch. So not only does it help the soil retain that moisture and prevent the loss to evaporation, but it also will make it a little bit more difficult for some of those weed seedlings to get germinated. The other benefit of adding hardwood mulch into your landscape is that it's also adding organic matter as it breaks down through the season. Now, there's one more option that you can use for weeds, and that is a pre or a post-emergent, basically your chemical options. So here we have a pre-emergent, which basically you just sprinkle it amongst your other plants. It's not going to affect anything that has already come up and germinated. However, it will prevent some seeds from germinating, specifically weed seeds. But you always want to make sure to check the label so that if you have put out beneficial seeds, that it doesn't interfere with their germination as well. And finally, the last thing you want to keep in mind is anytime you're using any sort of herbicide, is that you always check the label, because the label is the law. The other thing is you might look at a post-emergent. So if you see weeds that are coming up already, then as the name implies, you would want to apply a post-emergent, meaning that you apply it to green weeds that are already up, and that will cause them to die. The other thing to consider is herbicides are either selective or non-selective. So a selective herbicide might target a specific type of plant, like a grassy weed or a broadleaf weed, whereas non-selective herbicides will basically be detrimental to anything that is green. So again, whether this is an option for you or not, that is up for you to choose, but it is an option also to help you have a successful garden this spring. Having a proper water system in place is fundamental to having a successful garden. So often people start planning where their garden's going to be, and the first question I always ask is, where is your water source located? Because you want to make sure that you're putting your garden near your water source. There's nothing worse than growing a beautiful garden and then forgetting about it for a couple of days. And in our Oklahoma summers, a couple of days without water can be detrimental to your successful garden. So make sure you have a good water system. Now, a couple of things. If you have an irrigation system already in place, it's time to make sure you do an irrigation audit. Make sure you've changed those batteries if you have a battery operated controller, because again, you don't want that to be the reason your water fails. The other thing is, go ahead and run the cycle. Even though you might not need the irrigation just yet, run it so that you can ensure that there are no leaks in your system. You also want to make sure that the spray is still going in the proper locations. Plants grow, things break over the winter, and you just want to make sure that it's going to water your garden properly. If you don't have an irrigation system, I might suggest getting a faucet timer. Again, a lot of times these are battery operated, so you want to make sure you've changed the batteries in them. But this is a nice way to easily hook up your hose to an automatic irrigation system as well. If you haven't done irrigation at all, you might consider using drip irrigation. Drip irrigation is a great way to reduce evaporation and put the water exactly where it needs to go at the base of the plants. The other thing is, you don't want to forget about your containers and hanging baskets. Usually they're much smaller, and so they're going to dry out faster. Also, a lot of times they're either elevated or even hanging up in the air, and so they're going to be exposed to that higher ambient air temperature as well as the wind, causing them to dry out faster. In fact, it might be a good rule of thumb to check those daily if you don't have them on an irrigation system. But another simple fix to that is to check into getting a container irrigation kit. These are kits that you can easily adapt to your system and incorporate your containers and your hanging baskets into your irrigation system, making them a little bit easier as you go into those hot summer days. Now finally, if you don't have irrigation at all and you're relying on a hose, make sure that you're putting your garden somewhere that it's easily visible and accessible with a hose. If you have containers, and don't put them by your front door if you're always entering your house through your garage, because you're never going to see those containers until it's too late. Put them maybe by the back door where you frequently come in and out of your house, so that daily you see that visible reminder that it's time to water your garden. So there you have it. Soil prep, planting, pruning, weeding, and watering. Those are the 5 things you need to keep in mind as we head into the growing season. Now, I know this can all be a little bit overwhelming, especially if you're a new gardener. But the 2 biggest pieces of advice that I always give to new gardeners is 1, to have fun with it, and 2, regardless of what you're trying to grow, what you're really growing is your confidence in being a gardener. There are a lot of great horticulture activities this time of year. Be sure and consider some of these events in the weeks ahead.
If you're missing fresh garden vegetables, join us next week on Oklahoma Gardening.
Nutritional. You're actually... Dang it.
To find out more information about show topics as well as recipes, videos, articles, fact sheets, and other resources, including a directory of local extension offices, be sure to visit our website at oklahomagardening.okstate.edu. Join in on Facebook and Instagram. You can find this entire show and other recent shows as well as individual segments on our Oklahoma Gardening YouTube channel. Tune in to our OK Gardening Classics YouTube channel to watch segments from previous hosts. Oklahoma Gardening is produced by the Oklahoma Cooperative Extension Service as part of the Division of Agricultural Sciences and Natural Resources at Oklahoma State University. The Botanic Garden at OSU is home to our studio gardens, and we encourage you to come visit this beautiful Stillwater gem. We would like to thank our generous underwriters, the Oklahoma Department of Agriculture, Food, and Forestry, and Shape Your Future, a program of the Tobacco Settlement Endowment Trust. Additional support is also provided by Greenleaf Nursery and the Garden Debut Plants, the Oklahoma Horticulture Society, the Tulsa Garden Club, and the Tulsa Garden Center.